Okay, so the two professors we have Professor Daniel Robert, and he's a sensory biologist, and he's got 22 years' experience in biomechanics and sensory ecology. Effectively, he looks at the way things produce noises and sounds and all sorts of things like that, I guess. That's my take on it. And he is a professor of bio-nanoscience at the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Bristol. And I won't go through his full CV, but it's very impressive. But he's the recipient of a Royal Society Wilson Merit Award, so Research Merit Award. So I can guarantee he's going to be very authoritative. And the second part of the double act is Heather, Professor Heather Whitney, I'm sorry, because we have to call them two professors, don't we, Heather? And they kind of work quite well together because they both are looking at the curious behaviours of plants and the interaction of plants with insects, and that hits the topic for today, which is pollination. So you've heard enough of me. I'm going to sit down, and I'm going to hand over, first of all, to Heather, I think.
Brilliant.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Nigel. First of all, thank you so much for coming to this, and I seem to have picked the right day. It's absolutely gorgeous here at the moment. So, yes, I'm going to be talking about some of the science of pollination. In particular, what both Danielle and I will be talking about is this hidden world of signals that plants use to communicate with their pollinators. Okay, so let's see if this is working. So what we're starting off with is this idea of this hidden biodiversity of flowers. We can look at the amazing range of flowers in the garden here, in some of the hedgerows outside. But actually, we're only seeing a really small proportion of the diversity that's actually there. There's this whole hidden world that we don't see, don't sense, because we don't actually have the ability to do that. We're starting to see it and sense it because of the advances in technology. I'm going to tell you about some of those. But first of all, I suppose one of the questions is, why are we looking at this? Why is this hidden biodiversity good? Why is biodiversity good? Well, the answer to both of those, in one sense, could be seen as resilience. So biodiversity is essential as it supports so many life-sustaining processes, from clean air to clean water, to how the soil that grows all the plants actually provides plants with what they need. So it's essential just for life to exist. What's fascinating about biodiversity is that it can also provide a range of solutions to problems. And a common example of this is Velcro. That was actually inspired by certain seed pods, the burdock that gets caught on, or goosegrass that gets caught on your dog's coat when you go out for a walk, and then you have to very carefully take it out. That was observed, and that was used as bio-inspiration for producing Velcro. And so you've got the fact that millions of years of evolution have provided us with this range of fascinating solutions that we otherwise might not have thought of. But there's a particular problem that plants have to address in order to have successful animal pollination, and that is, how do you communicate with another organism that not only is a different organism to you, but is in a completely different kingdom? So you have the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. How do those two actually communicate successfully so you have efficient and effective pollination? And how do you do that as a plant when the environment and the conditions that you're growing in are constantly changing? It's beautifully sunny today, but tomorrow we might have clouds whooshing overhead, so you might go from really bright sun to relatively shady. You've got trees moving, you've got wind, you've got rain, constantly changing conditions. How do you make sure that your message gets across successfully in these changing conditions? And going back to that original question, why is diversity good? Well, diverse ecosystems are more resilient to change. And equally, a diverse range of signals appear to be able to communicate in an ever-changing environment. So what we're going to talk about today is this diversity of floral signals. We're going to particularly focus on the ones that maybe are less obvious. So flowers have this diversity of signals, and there's evidence that this diversity of signals reinforce each other and can help pollinators in different conditions deal with uncertainty. So is this actually the flower that I previously visited and I know will have a reward in, like nectar, that I actually want to visit? And this means that it makes the learning carried out by the pollinator more resilient. So one way of looking at this is flowers as a sensory billboard. It's this idea that flowers have this array of different signals in a range of different ways that they do this. That act both as an advert, sort of, come here, I'm a flower with lots of rewards, and also as an instruction manual telling the insect where on the flower to land and where to go in the flower to get the reward, and also get covered in pollen at the same time, which is what the flower wants. However, while a lot of these signals have previously been seen or are fairly obvious, we can see their diversity of colour, of pattern, of size, of scent, there are some signals, a huge diversity of signals, that we're actually missing out on because we can't detect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick smorgasbord of some of those signals and then hand over to Danielle for a bit more detail on one of them in particular. Okay, so one that you might have come across before is the hidden signal of ultraviolet patterning. So here we have an evening primrose, and to our eyes it is a solid yellow flower, but if you look at it with a UV camera, you can see there's actually a gorgeous swirling pattern that is shown up, if you, like a bee, can see in ultraviolet. So the insects that pollinate this flower can see in ultraviolet, which is why it's a particularly appropriate pattern for them. Now, a different signal that acts in a range of different ways is a diversity of floral surface texture. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed or considered this before, but if you go into the garden or a florist and you pick up a tulip, and you think about the surface of that tulip petal, it's got a gorgeous satiny sheen to it. But if you then think something like a rose petal, and think about the texture of that petal, instead of being satiny, it's more velvet. And that's because the surface texture of a rose petal and the surface texture of a tulip tepal are completely different. So hopefully up on the screen, you can actually see a range of some of the different surface textures that flowers actually have all over their petals. And if you look at petals and get your eye in, you can actually see that a lot of petals have patterns in different surface textures. And if you're interested, what you can do to separate out the pigment underneath the surface and the actual overlying surface texture is you can actually take your petal and you can put it into dental wax. And you can leave the dental wax to set, take the petal out, and then pour in something like epoxy. Or a lot of jewellers actually use silver metal clay to get the surface texture of petals. And you can then use that on something like an electron microscope and see the diversity of different surface textures. So I've actually got one I made earlier, and if you want to come up, if there's something you found interesting, you can actually see epoxy casts of different flowers, and I'm happy to pass that round if anyone wants to look. So I've actually named what the different species are there. But why does different surface textures impact at all on pollinators? Well, they have a range of different effects. So one thing we've also recently discovered is that flowers have patterns of temperature. And this is really great for pollinators. A bee actually quite likes a warm centre to a flower. Oh, I think the slides have gone down. Sorry, it seems to have gone blank. So basically, a lot of flowers have... Oh, back up, back up. Oh. Okay. I will do this via mime now. Basically, lots of flowers have a warmer centre. This is because actually warmth can act as a reward for pollinators. If you're a small insect who can't self-heat yourself, then actually a warmer temperature can act as an additional metabolic reward. And there's a number of ways we're learning flowers might actually provide this metabolic reward. The surface texture itself can actually act as almost like a magnifying glass and enhance the temperature of the flower in certain places. Darker flowers are also slightly warmer, and also the whole structure of the flower can act a bit like a solar oven and help warm the flower. Okay, so as well as potentially influencing the temperature of the flower, surface texture can also provide something quite useful for bees. They can help bees grip onto the flower. Now, in some flowers, the reason why this is good is obvious. You've got something like a snapdragon, and the bee's got to land on a snapdragon, open the snapdragon, crawl into the snapdragon. That takes a bit of handling. And as such, if you're on a snapdragon that's up like this, you've got to do it all basically vertically. Having extra grip is really useful. But we find these more grippy cells on the flowers all over the plant kingdom. You're wondering, but they're not all difficult to handle. Why do they all have these? And if this was working, I would show you why they often need to have them. It is because, again, we need to consider the flower as a whole in its ecosystem. If you go out today, probably even more so tomorrow, it might be windy. Flowers move quite a lot in the wind. And what we found is those grippy surfaces that help bees grip onto the flower are actually really useful to bees if the flower is moving. And you can understand that if you're trying to sort of climb onto a landing pad and the landing pad's moving, having a non-slip surface is really quite useful. Right. You can see that one. Can we go on one more? And one more. Oh, has it crashed it? That might be the problem. Oh. Okay, could you go back a couple? One more. Perfect. So, one other thing that these surface textures can do is they can both impact on and generate colour. So, we know that some of these surface textures have a cone shape on them, a conical cell. And this, as well as helping pollinators grip onto the surface, it also helps focus light into the pigment that's part of the cell. And what this does is it helps make the colour deeper, but also different surface textures actually, like for example, found on Hibiscus trionum here, actually generate colour. They do something called, they generate structural colour. So most colour we know of is pigment, it's a dye, but then some colour, for example, on the back of a CD or a DVD, that's made by the structure of the material being around the same size as the wavelength of light, manipulating the light to produce a colour. And we found that actually quite a few flowers have this structural colour. So an example here that I found actually back from 1910 in a South African floral is Porridia capensis, where this particular flower has this bright iridescent centre to the flower, which if you then look at it under a microscope, the structure is actually like a living opal. Now, I love this. It's this idea of what Fabergé made with his Fabergé's flowers, making flowers out of gems. We've actually got flowers that make living gems that actually have already evolved. So one final example of how the structure can make colour is this plant here, which I suspect lots of you as gardeners will know. So this is Cerinthe purpurea. Now, hopefully lots of you have seen this in high summer when it's bright metallic blue. I've got some nodding, brilliant. Now, That bright metallic blue is produced in a really interesting way. While the actual flowers are, like with this one here, which the garden team have very kindly provided me, are just normal purple. That's a normal purple pigment flower. The metallic blue that's found around the flower is produced by wax. And it's the structure of the waxes. If I was to wipe off some of that metallic blue wax, I wouldn't end up with a metallic blue thumb, because wiping off the wax destroys the structure and there's no pigment producing that blue. So we're finding this is actually more widespread than we ever realised. So, just to finish off my section, it's to open up this idea that flowers are a sensory billboard with a range of new ways of communicating, that some of which we're only just discovering, and we've previously missed out on much of this diversity because we cannot detect it. I think that's the perfect point to hand over to Danielle for another new cue.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here and to see so many of you. I'm not that much of a gardener myself, but I do a little bit of it. And usually gardening is kind of a solitary activity. That's a bit why we do it. It's between us and the plant, isn't it? So to see an entire swarm of you here is quite exceptional. So I'm flattered, and yeah. What are we going to talk about? So yes, Heather set it up very nicely. Indeed, there's an entire world out there that we're touching upon only now, because not only we've got the technology, as Heather said, but also we're starting to ask the right questions as well. We're saying, okay, are plants really as sedentary and thoughtless as people have made them to be? I'm not saying that they are thoughtful, but they have actually, evolutionarily speaking, evolved mechanisms, evolved tricks, basically, to exploit their environment, including bees, including pollinators, that we may not have always appreciated very much. Now, I entitled this The Bee, the Flower, and the Electric Field. You will know from the title what it is about. It's about bees, flowers, and electric fields. So here we are. And why would it be that there is an electric field? So I owe you a little bit of an explanation now on, you can see this bumblebee here on a flower, and the idea is it's covered in pollen. It is quite clear, and everybody here, this is the best audience for that. We know what pollination is about. This is sort of a relationship, a polite exploitation or cooperation, depending on how we see it, between a flower that wants to be pollinated, wants the insects to actually push this pollen and go and pollinate another flower of the same species. And this is the key element here, is that a bee would need to go, more likely than not, this is probably a statistical argument as well, to the next flower of the same species. So how flowers, and we all agree they look pretty, don't they? They're nice. We like to grow them because they please us. They didn't evolve to please us, obviously. They evolved to please insects. And when that happens, basically, they, as Heather explained, there is a whole gamut of attractants. You want to be pretty for the bees. You want to be attractive. You want to keep them interested in that particular pattern that in the morning they go out and learn. These are the flowers. This is the plant that will reward me with nectar and with pollen. They eat both. For the flower, of course, the deal is I want my pollen to go out. The price for it is that I produce nectar. Some flowers expand 27-30% of their metabolic energy daily into producing nectar. Some don't at all. Orchids, they are sufficient to smell nice and to look nice. But there is a bit of an effort there. So this is really something that bees respond to. Bees, on the other hand, what they want is to feed as fast as possible, because they're on a schedule, they've got the babies at home, they need to go back and feed them, and there are lots of them, yeah? So this is what they are set to do. And bees and flowers have evolutionarily understood that, and they cooperate quite nicely. So nice reciprocal exploitation. Polite. what happens, though, is that when too many bees go onto a flower, and this is the crux of my presentation, it may well be that that particular flower will run out of nectar. So that bribing that the flowers offer might run out. And the problem is that bees have a bit of a brain as well. If they go to that flower several times, or to a particular type of flowers, and these flowers don't provide anymore, they stop going there. And more than that, individual bees stop going there, but they go back to the hive and they tell their sisters not to go there. So when you're a flower, you're a bit under the pressure of performing. And the problem is, as I say in my talks regularly, at every talk I give on the subject, the last thing you want to do is to disappoint a bee. And that's because suddenly you're out of business, indeed. Now, the correlate of that is, imagine you go to the supermarket, and because we are here, you want to have your half pint of semi-skimmed Yo Valley organic milk, and they run out of it at the supermarket. Of course they would, because it's good stuff, isn't it? So what do? You go there once, you go there a second time, you go the third time, you start to think, okay, I'm going to change supermarket now, because they don't provide. Have you ever noticed that the supermarkets put the milk at the end? It's always you have to go through everything else before going there. That's because, like flowers, like the snapdragon that Heather mentioned, the flower wants the bee to work a little bit to get to the goodies. They want to go past the pollen, just as an aside like this. But the problem for a flower is that how do they tell the bee that there is no nectar left? If you don't want to disappoint that bee, you could change color, you could change scent, you can change texture. That's not very possible. You can't change color in 2 minutes. Yeah? There are some flowers that change their color when they get pollinated, but that's over by then. They're not interested in bees anymore. Closing the corolla takes a long time. However, we noticed, and I give it to you straight there, very fast, we noticed that actually bees and flowers interact in an electric way. And that had been, we saw YouTube videos, that pollen is actually jumping from a flower to a bee. And it's not falling like, you throw a tennis ball and it goes like this. It's going straight from the flower to the bee. So that was some years ago that, and this is actually work we did with Heather, so this was her lab and my lab, we worked together on that. We managed to ask the question, basically, there is an electric field. We had some physics students in the lab there, and then we thought, well, if there's an electric field, and this is true that pollen moves from one to the other, and people have seen that, the key question is, does the bee know about it? Is there a possibility that when the bee interacts with the flower and the bee build up this kind of electric signal that is a true signal of providing for nectar and pollen or not? That was the key question. Long story short, again, work with Heather, we could demonstrate that bees are capable of learning the presence of electric fields. Everything else being taken away, scientists do that, they take everything away, they just simplify the thing to the max, and then we reconstruct to go up to nature again. But an electric field is sufficient for the bee to take a choice between a flower that has nectar and a flower that doesn't have nectar. So that was the key moment, and that can change very fast. So here is that supermarket door that says, sorry, no milk at the moment, come back a little bit later. And you'll be way more forgiving in your customership if you know in advance that perhaps you don't need to put the effort into it. So you don't completely neglect it. There we go. So I'm trying to go forward now. So here we are. We've got a flower, we've got a bee. Flowers tend to be negative because they've got their feet in the ground, which is full of electrons, so they can actually charge up with electrons. You know that there are lots of electrolytes in there, so salts that are conductive. Therefore, they will tend to draw electrons, negative charges to the corolla, whilst bees, here a bumblebee, is actually positively charged because as they fly through the environment, they will lose electrons by friction. You know, when you have a balloon, you rub a balloon on your hair, and then you can stick it to the wallpaper or the paint or something. You can do mean tricks on kids as well and have them look like this. So try that at home if you have kids of that age. So this is fun, and then they can think they're a bee going into a flower. So there's a bit of a nice romantic approach to it as well. So the idea is that a bee would be positively charged, a flower would be negative, which means that there is a nice little physical law called Coulomb's law that is satisfied, by which there will be a force in between. And that little force is what gives the bee the information that that flower has a charge. Now, of course, we have to demonstrate that, and I won't be able to show you all that, but here is a computer model basically that shows the charge around the bumblebee as it is in the atmosphere, as it has flown through the air and lost charges, and it moves on to a flower. And here we've got a computer rendition of how the electric field looks like when that bumblebee approaches a petunia. So B plus, flower negative. And that is actually quite necessary to do this computer modeling because there are no cameras or microphones or instruments that can show you an electric field. This is a difficult thing to measure. So we're still working on that to try to make a proper visualization and test of the computer models. But we know the field exists because what we can do is put an electrode into the stem of that petunia, shield it from electric fields, and in a cage in the lab, we've got here an experiment where you've got, and I hope it will work, that video, so you get a graph on the foreground, and the time is on the horizontal axis, and the voltage that we can measure on the stem of that petunia is on the vertical axis. And you can see that that curve is going down slowly. Now, because you have got two eyes, you'll be able to keep an eye on that black line and keep the other eye on where the bee is going to show up. Because what's going to happen is the bumblebee is going to show up from the top left, vaguely, a third left to top, and then come down and land on the petunia. If at the moment, just before it lands on the petunia, you look at the black curve, you will see what I mean. Could you play the video? It's on. So suddenly the bee will show up. Now it's stopped, isn't it? No. Right. Can you try to start it again with the cursor? Thank you. Right. Okay. Same effect. What you would have seen, back to mime. It's just as good rehearsed. We've been, both of us, for 2 years in France, but I'm not French, don't worry. The idea is that you get that potential like that, and as the bee approaches the flower, that potential goes up. Even before the bee touches the flower, that potential goes up. So the flowers are basically seeing the electricity produced by a bee. How crazy is that? Does it work? No. Okay. I need to move on. But then, of course, as the flower depolarizes, as we said, the potential goes up, the bee leaves, and that flower continues to depolarize. If a second bee comes in, it polarizes even further, which means that the presence of the bee that has come to service that flower, and that flower having actually done the job, saying, yep, I've done this one, will somehow automatically indicate to the next bees that that flower has had already a bit of business with that bee. And they will start to produce maybe a bit more nectar or a bit more scent. We've got some evidence towards these things, that the flower is extremely reactive to the presence of the bee on the basis of that electric field. If we don't have an electric field, none of that would happen. Okay, let's move on. I had a wonderful demonstration as well that doesn't work. Which, that lovely noise, I know, sorry. It's annoying, isn't it? Well, bear with me. Did you hear the change there? Right, so in theory, Benzi, artificial bee that I charge up electrically, and I go like this, and you would hear that woo, woo, going like this. Now, Why doesn't it work? It's because we are under the cover of that tent, and that actually cancels the electric field. There's something very strange going on with the electric field of that tent, with the wires, and this is very humid here. So, of course, humidity, as you know, when it's humid, your hair is not static. Yeah? When it's drier, your hair becomes static. It's the same principle. So, there we go. We could have seen that right here. So, come back next year, maybe. So, summary, bee and flower, electrics. Now, I would be not telling you the whole thing if I didn't introduce another aspect, which is related to the fact that this hasn't worked today. It worked this morning in my garden, but we can go further than that. Is that we've got a bee, positive, flower, negative, and we've got what is called this atmospheric potential gradient, which is the fact that the atmosphere is actually charged in electricity. Even in a nice day without a cloud, there will be 100 volts per meter worth of electricity going up to several kilovolts, so thousands and thousands of volts up in altitude. There is no conduction there, there's no current, so we don't risk anything in terms of, 100 volts is not that much at the end. But what it means is that a flower growing into that gradient of potential will actually be more negative than it would be normally. So it's as if, as an automatic feature of the atmosphere around the Earth, and that's valid for all plants, it is actually, they stick out their flowers into a positive field, which means that they will have more negative charges going up. So it's as if that bias or that signal is being emphasized by the weather as well. And that's a recent discovery that we want to continue and further. But that's part of that triangular relationship, so it makes things a bit more complicated. That will go on. So now you'll never see a field of a meadow of cosmos the same way again, because the atmosphere is positive, and these cosmos have all sorts of colors. Pretty much like Heather has said, you'll never see a flower again when you know that insects are looking at them differently. Try to project in your mind the fact that they have patterns that we don't see, but we can sort of guess them now. We can teach ourselves to look at it that way. Looking at a screen on a phone, we believe all sorts of things that are just two-dimensional pixels. Yeah, it's as if it was real. Here, it's even more real that actually the meadows, as you look at them, they change their electricity all the time. So this is one thing I wanted to share with you, and that a humble petunia has an electric field around itself as well, and it serves a purpose as well. And then a message to take home, perhaps, that flowers charge bees for nectar. It helps remember the fact that actually this is all a charge thing. And then I'm happy to answer questions, but one little note is that we know how bees also detect the electric field. It's with their little hairs, very tiny hairs. I told you about that force, that Coulomb force, which is very tiny. It's not enough to attract the bee to the flower like two magnets would be attracting each other. Yeah? This is way too weak. We're talking about a millionth of ampere, if it means something. Yeah? It's pretty low. But here, we've got these little hairs, and we know because we've tested that in the lab, in the presence of an electric field like that of a flower, these little hairs would start to vibrate. And this is how they would detect the electric field. And we know other insects do that as well by now. So this is it for me. Thank you for the attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, I don't know about you, but I could have listened to that for another hour, probably. Fascinating topic, and it's great to hear experts talking about things which are... We don't really yet know that much about the way communication happens in plants and things, and the trees and everything else. But we're learning, aren't we? And thanks to these guys, this is the sort of thing, it's cutting edge. So I allowed them to run over a little. So but we have got some time for some questions. So if anybody's got any questions, put the hand up, and I'm sure we've got loads. We've got a roving microphone.
Thank you very much for your fantastic presentations. I would like to know, how do you measure biodiversity? Thank you.
That's an interesting question. There are lots of ways of measuring it. So, for example, the way I've just described it, this hidden biodiversity, no one started measuring the diversity of structures or whatever. So again, this is a field that's changing. So we can look at it from the number of species, the number of subspecies, we can look at the genetic diversity, we can look at the number of individuals. So that's an entire field in itself, I'm afraid.
So you talked about having, this is not the right terminology, but like grippy and fantastic landing pads. What would be the easiest one to grow in the UK and the best?
So actually a lot of the flowers that, for example, petunia, not only has an amazing electric field, but also has really great conical cells on it. So conical cells are the really grippy ones. So actually a lot of the bee-pollinated flowers that you're growing anyway, a lot of them do have conical cells. The ones that don't are things like buttercups, really, which we think they can be more generalist and also trying to get things like flies and hoverflies and some of the more solitary insects that aren't bees to come and visit, that don't rely on the conical cells to grip quite as much.
Thank you. I think, Danielle, you referred to an energy cost that plants allocate to their various forms, and particularly, are you able, is it far enough in your studies to start to understand the sort of correlation between plants in certain environments or certain habitats or certain structures know that they're going to have to pay a higher energy cost because of the competition around them? You know, for instance, a grass has no particular flower, it's got no attraction, but remarkably, you know, is there something that you can therefore say, actually, the energy cost is allocated in this way?
I can respond in perhaps a general way that definitely different plants will invest different tissues into creating a flower. Some generate a lot of small flowers, some very discrete flowers, some very little nectar. So species by species, to start with that, yes, they will have followed an evolutionary path that will be good enough for them. And often it will relate to a particular pollination syndrome, to a particular pollinator, type of pollinator that these structures will be addressed to, like flies or moths. Yeah, some will produce flowers that will service hummingbirds, for instance. Completely different cause there. Now, for the environment, this is a more complicated question, but this is a really fundamental question as well. As we know that the environment is changing and some plants are growing here, but it's getting drier, how is that change going to take place? Are they going to be able to invest the energy that they used to attract the right pollinators or the right attention from other plants as well, and in that changing climate? Usually, the way plants do is that they die on the spot and their seeds go further and they grow somewhere else where it's more suitable, if there is such a place. That's a fundamental question onto how these things are actually changing and how both insects and plants are going to shift their ways if they need to, or adapt maybe to the boundaries of what they can do.
I think we'll have time for about 3 more questions. So at the back there, and then we'll take over here, and then we'll go over there because we don't want to leave you all out.
Hi. I recently read an article that said about bumblebees being affected by man-made electrical fields, but it doesn't affect honeybees. I don't know if you've got any views on that. I'm a beekeeper, so I'm particularly interested in the honeybees side of things as well as bumbles. But
Do you take it? Do I take it?
I think you can
take
take
it.
it.
Yes. This is, again, a very good question. Yes, I've read some articles as well. We've looked at it a little bit. There is an effect. Whether it's an effect that we should be alarmed by or not is still open. There are countries where they put their hives under power lines and they're perfectly happy with that. Some others, they're not happy with that. It is a very complicated problem. But indeed, bumblebees and honeybees are different species. They will react differently. I'm not saying it is all the same. Our own observations is that if you, in the middle of nowhere, where we actually control the electric environment, and we change the potential of the plant with electrodes and so, we notice, put cameras on, that honeybees are less likely to land on a plant that doesn't have the right potential, or the same potential as the neighbors has. So there is an effect there. Whether it has an effect on the overall fitness of the bees, I refrain to say. I don't know.
One more over here, and then if there's one over that side, so we balance it out.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Mine's a really, after those technical questions, quite simple. So why do we have lots of different coloured flowers if the bees are just looking at the ultraviolet light?
It's more you.
I think a way of looking at it is like, why do we have lots of different coloured packaging? In some ways, what the flower is trying to do is give the bee a unique set of information. So the bee will go from a flower of one species to the same flower, to a different flower of the same species. So what the flowers are trying to do is actually compete with other flowers by standing out. So this is another reason why we have this huge range of signals. You're trying to basically shout in lots of different ways. You're shouting electrically, you're shouting using volatile scent, you're shouting using colour. And if all the other flowers are mauve, for example, then it would probably stand out if you're a yellow flower. But of course, then other flowers then shift to yellow. So there's strategies for choosing which colour you are and how you stand out so that the bee carries the pollen to the correct flower.
Do we have one on this side? Let's have one on this side.
Thank you. With all the different types of gardening, so compost, organic, no dig, does that change the electric frequencies or the strength of the frequencies?
We have a paper that showed and that we had organic petunias and lavender and all that. We had a few different ones, and we sprayed them with fertilizer, just a normal fertilizer. I can't tell if it's organic or not there. I'm not a specialist, but the idea is that we didn't put a pesticide or anything like that. And we saw that the electric field would be different. We could measure that the electric field of the flower, once it has been sprayed and dried, was different. So there's a coating that takes place that will change the electric properties of the surface, which are insulators. So this is an interesting kind of electricity there that is at play. And then that sort of disappears, and then you spray it with water, deionized water, and the effect comes back. So it's not like it washes out and then it's like nothing was. So it is quite an interesting one, yeah.
Also try putting the fertilizer in the water, or
Just as a spray. It doesn't mean the end of the world, yeah? We don't know. This is a measurable difference, but it may be a difference that everybody can accommodate with. It doesn't matter. But there was an interesting effect.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. A great shame, but we will have more speakers later on. Just like to say thank you to Heather and to Danielle. Thank you.